Hello, this is Moral Politics with Bill Alford. I'm your host, Valerie Tarico. Seattle author Andrew Himes is the son of a pastor, the grandson of a pastor, the great-grandson of a pastor, the uncle of a pastor, the nephew of pastors. And yet his own life spiritual quest has taken a very different turn. He recently released a book, The Sword of the Lord, in which he explores the history of American fundamentalism in the history of one American family, his own. He's here with us today to talk with us about that book. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
Why don't you start by telling us about the title of your book, The Sword of the Lord?
Well, The Sword of the Lord was the title or the name of a newspaper founded by my granddad, John R. Rice, in 1935 in Texas. The newspaper was the masthead of the newspaper in 1935 actually said the sword of the Lord and of John R. Rice.
From the Bible, was it the sword of the Lord and of Gideon or something, right?
That's right. There was a story in the Old Testament about Gideon and the Israelites who surrounded the encampment of the Philistines with lamps that were hidden inside of jars, and they snuck up on the Philistines, broke their jars all at the same time. Their flames lit up the night, and they descended on the hapless Philistines with their swords.
It's
kind of a bloody story.
A bloody story indeed. So what in the world would make him choose that title for his newspaper and you choose it for your book?
Well, that story actually was the story of how 300, a tiny handful of Israelites, beat a huge army of many, many thousands of Philistines, causing them to slaughter each other instead. So it's a martial image. It's a martial image of conflict and of violent assault on enemies. And that seems to be it's a metaphor that has resounded in the history of Christianity, and especially in America, I think. We know songs like "Onward, Christian Soldiers" and "Hold the Fort, for I Am Coming," and that great song of the Civil War. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord and the marching of soldiers to battle. So the history of fundamentalism in some ways is the history of defending fundamental principles, or what were thought to be fundamental principles of Christianity, in defending them against what was perceived as the assaults of enemies to Christianity.
And you list those songs, those images, the sword of the Lord, onward Christian soldiers, and right off the bat, I think you have both what people see as some of the optimism of fundamentalist Christianity and the dark side, in that you've got these images of militarism, of triumphalism, mixed with kind of hope and courage.
The combination in the history of Christianity, as a matter of fact, this kind of integration of violence and nonviolence, of love and of rage, is a really interesting kind of combination. It was, for example, Jesus was one of the first people in the history of the world to express a complete vision of nonviolence in the world. It was when he was in the garden, and Peter said, a Roman soldier came up, and Peter drew his sword and sliced off the man's ear. Jesus picked up the ear, plastered it back on, healed the man, and said to Peter, "He who lives by the sword shall die by the sword." So this combination of both violence and nonviolence, a philosophy of nonviolence, at the heart of a history of a certain amount of violence. That's pretty interesting, I think.
I might push back at you about whether Jesus was the first to articulate that, given the very powerful tradition of ahimsa, of nonviolence or non-harm in some of the earlier Eastern religions,
Buddhism.
Yeah,
that's certainly true, yeah.
For example. But it is interesting that describe that tension within Christianity: violence, nonviolence, the sword of the Lord, and at the same time, even within American Christianity, there are sects of Christianity who are complete pacifists.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting to me, and one of the things that I talk about in the book is the history of the word fundamentalism, where that came from.
Tell us more about that.
Well, it didn't exist. Nobody had ever heard the word fundamentalism before 1919, as a matter of fact. There was it started, the whole kind of movement began before the First World War. A set of booklets called The Fundamentals were published in the United States and then distributed to virtually every pastor, every minister, every Sunday school teacher, deacon, missionary in the United States. And this set of booklets were designed to describe what were thought to be the fundamental doctrines of Christianity.
So these booklets were saying, if you want to call yourself a Christian, this is it.
You have to agree with this set of doctrines. You have to give intellectual assent to this set of doctrines.
What were those doctrines?
Those there were lots of things that they talked about in these 30-some booklets, I believe, but there were 5 doctrines that were absolutely at the heart of it, and that were emblazoned on leaflets and preached about, and were the object of great controversy and conflict within Protestant denominations especially. Those 5 doctrines were, first of all, the inerrancy of Scripture, this idea that God inspired the Bible and that it was utterly and completely without error. Secondly, the virgin birth. Thirdly, the blood atonement, that Jesus' death saves us from going to hell. Then the physical resurrection of Jesus and other miracles in the New Testament performed by Jesus. And finally, the premillennial return of Jesus in a second coming before his millennial reign on earth.
Now, I've heard it said that almost any creedal statement within Christianity is half of an argument, and that the reason a creed gets issued, or something like a set of fundamentals, is because some subset of Christians has arisen in a powerful way that disagrees with those. Is that the case in this situation?
That's absolutely the case. In the case of the fundamentals, it was actually after the First World War when these fundamentals were fashioned into a creed in that way, in a very explicit way. And the word fundamentalism was invented at the meeting of the World Christian Fundamentals Association in 1919. It was created in the wake of the First World War, which was the most extraordinary bloodbath in the history of humanity. It was written when a lot of conservative evangelicals were concluding that the last days were upon us, and that Christians had to rally around the flag of these 5 doctrines. And what was most interesting to me in writing my book was that not what the 5 doctrines were, but rather what they did not include. For example, these 5 doctrines did not include the doctrine of the Trinity, which was the most, in some ways, the most significant doctrine of the Christian church for 17 centuries.
And that's because the doctrine of the Trinity was uncontested?
It wasn't uncontested. Even within the Christian church, there were always people who thought about that idea of the Trinity in different ways. But it was very much at the center of both the Catholic Church and then after the Protestant Reformation, all of the Protestant denominations that came out of the Reformation focused on the Trinity. But that wasn't thought to be one of the fundamentals.
So it wasn't what people felt threatened by.
I think that's exactly right. Another doctrine of the church that wasn't included in the fundamentals was at the heart of the Protestant Reformation. It was the doctrine of salvation by faith through grace, that you didn't have to pay some priest an indulgence in order to get into heaven, that salvation was free. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't one of the fundamentals. And maybe most important, the fundamentals in no way mentioned or identified the teachings of Jesus, the examples of Jesus, or his lifetime, his ministry, as fundamental to the Christian faith.
Fascinating. So Andrew, how has that changed our Christian culture, in the culture of Christianity in the United States?
Well, fundamentalists thought that they were in a great battle, and actually the definition of fundamentalism that I find both entertaining, I guess, and has some validity, was proposed by a guy named George Marsden, who's an academic and a theologian who's written many books about the history of Christianity and of fundamentalism especially. Marsden's definition of a fundamentalist was an evangelical who's angry about something. And I can identify that. I've spent a lot of my life being very angry at a lot of different people. So I think that that's true. That the word fundamentalism identifies a battle within Christianity over who gets to own the religion, who gets to own the set of beliefs that we call fundamentalism. And especially fundamentalists, but liberals and what fundamentalists thought of as modernists were equally engaged in that battle. It was all about who's going to speak for God, who's going to own the history and the memory and the legacy of Jesus. So.
And yet you're saying that the people who staked out the turf, who said, we speak for God, these are the fundamentals, didn't talk about the ministry of Jesus.
Well, they didn't talk about the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was always, I'd say that there was, I grew up in a fundamentalist family, and so I grew up with the teachings and songs about Jesus and the stories of Jesus and all the rest. But for me, I think there was always this great conflict in my understanding of what Jesus was all about. It was kind of like, God did a good cop, bad cop routine. And the good cop was God the Father, or rather the bad cop, the angry cop, the judgmental cop, the cop that wanted to send you to hell was God the Father. And Jesus was the good cop, the nice cop. He was the cop on the corner who helped you across the street and made sure that you didn't get run down by a car on your way to grade school. My favorite song when I was a child and in Sunday school was This Little Light of Mine. This little light of mine, Jesus gave it to me, and I'm going to let it shine all over the world, in my neighborhood. I'm going to hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine.
You identified with the good cop.
Absolutely. I was all about Jesus as the good cop when I was a kid, and I was terrified, and I had nightmares about God the Father, the bad cop, when I was a little boy. But also Jesus, it wasn't just about me. The other song that I remember just loving as a little boy was Jesus loves the little children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, Jesus loves the children of the world. For me, there was embedded in that song this vision of social justice and of liberation for all of humanity. It wasn't just about white folks in the South, in a little town in the South where I lived. It was about black folks and white folks and red folks and green folks and people everywhere, no matter who they were. It was about liberation and about compassion.
There's so much paradox in this conversation. What could be more terrifying for a child than that image of the sword of the Lord and of Gideon, of those jars crashing, fire in the night, and people being slaughtered, and on the other hand, this image of children being loved universally, completely.
How do you live with that? I don't even know how you live with that. I don't know
how did that come back to this sense of a fundamentalist feeling under siege, feeling threatened. How did that play out in your own family?
Well, in my family, I was born in a place called Wheaton, Illinois, which is kind of an evangelical global capital.
I went to school in Wheaton. I know Wheaton well.
That's right. I lived a block away from the campus. As a matter of fact, the house that I grew up in Wheaton, this is before we moved back down south with the rest of the family. The house that I moved into when I was 4 years old with my family, all I knew about it was that it was a very old house, and it had a basement that had been constructed out of field stones, and you kind of crept down this very narrow staircase, went into the basement, and it was only about 5 feet tall, so I could stand upright, but my parents could not. They kind of hunched like that. And I found out only several years ago that that house was built for and owned then by Jonathan Blanchard in 1861, the very first president of Wheaton College. And it was also probably used as a stop on the Underground Railroad because slaves fleeing the conflagration and the war in the South went north, and Wheaton College and Blanchard's house were used as stations on the railroad.
Which is another one of the paradoxes in your family history, right? This kind of sense of justice for all, of involvement in civil rights, personally being deeply passionate about civil rights, and at the same time, people being involved in the Ku Klux Klan.
So I just didn't know how to deal with any of that. You know, growing up in my family, I thought of Christians and Christianity as being deeply opposed to social movements, social justice, social progress, or civil rights in any way. And I got that notion from the sermons and the teachings of my granddad, who himself was had been a Southerner. He himself was born in Texas, raised in Texas. His father, another Baptist preacher, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan and a Texas state senator. Our family had come during the Civil War from Missouri as war refugees in 1863, fleeing the fighting in Missouri, and in Missouri for a generation and a half had been slave owners. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in this Southern family, though I was born in the North. And for me, it was a shock, actually, to find out, long after I was grown up, that in the 19th century, the leaders of progressive movements to end slavery and create equality for women and to end child labor in factories, people who were deeply concerned about poverty and about changing America so that it reflected the dreams of the founders for all of those years ago. The people who led those movements were evangelicals. The people who led those movements were people who connected what they thought of as the most compelling message of their faith with the transformation of the world and the bringing of the kingdom of God to earth. So it was a shock for me to find out that Blanchard, Jonathan Blanchard, the founder of the first president of Wheaton College, was one of the most prominent abolitionists in America. He spent 20 years traveling the country debating slave owners and advocates of slavery.
I wonder how many people at Wheaton College during the 1960s knew that.
I don't know. I don't think that very many people did. The focus in the 1950s, 1940s, and the 1930s at Wheaton College, I think, was it was all about kind of agreeing with the fundamentals of the faith. It was about making sure that your hair was the right length. If you were a boy, it was making sure that you didn't cut your hair. If you were a girl, it was making sure. As a matter of fact, when my parents both attended Wheaton College, along with all 5 of my aunts, who met almost all of them met their husbands as students at Wheaton College. And when my father, I saw this document a couple of years ago in his papers after he died, when he was accepted as a student at Wheaton College, he signed a statement saying that he would dress according to the dress code of Wheaton College. He would always be in church every time the church was opened. He would agree with those 5 fundamentals and in every way be a proper representative of Wheaton College.
So at that point, it sounded like Wheaton College had kind of come down inside of a box. Mm-hmm. that kind of what you describe as those 5 fundamentals, they had come down on one half of the argument about who was going to speak for God.
A couple of huge battles within Protestant Christianity that shaped your experience as a student at Wheaton College that you probably weren't all that aware of. For one thing, there was this first battle over the fundamentals in the 1920s, and essentially the people who lost the struggle were the fundamentalists. and they withdrew from the mainstream Christian, the Protestant denominations, and created their own associations or denominations in some cases, or they just became independents. So I grew up in an independent fundamentalist Baptist church, right?
With the sense, the sword of the Lord, with the sense
right.
that there was a battle going on, a spiritual battle that was being waged against the servants of God.
Against other people who called themselves Christians but didn't agree with the fundamentals, but also against the entire rest of the world. My grandfather was a separatist. He believed that Christians needed to hold themselves apart from the world and hold themselves apart in every way from people who didn't agree with us on the fundamentals of the faith. So, and the whole world of, there was, at that time actually, there was no differentiation between evangelicals and fundamentalists. Everybody, including everybody who went to Wheaton College, was in the same camp, and it was called the fundamentalist camp. And that began to break down in the 1940s and 50s. Probably the most prominent person who came out of that background and then went on to national and international fame was Billy Graham. Billy was a student with my parents at Wheaton College in the 1940s, and then was mentored by my granddad, was first introduced to the world. The first revival meetings that he held were in North Carolina, a statewide revival campaign that were sponsored by the Sword of the Lord. And
you know, it turns out that Billy Graham's ministry is still creating controversy. They've been holding rallies on military bases around the country.
Is that
in
right?
apparent violation of some of the standards. Well, there's controversy over whether they are in violation of some of the standards of separation of church and state, because there's been government monies diverted to fund those rallies.
Right.
But all of which, I guess, is to say that this legacy is still ongoing. There's still controversy around it, even to this day.
Right.
Your granddad's legacy. In your book, you talk about the history of a group that probably most people haven't heard of, the Scots-Irish, and the way that that culture came across and the role it plays in the sense of beleaguerment, and possibly the way that this kind of militarized version of Christianity has played out in our own culture. Can you tell us a little about that?
Sure. Well, the Scots-Irish, first of all, they weren't Irish. They were, the story is that there were people who lived in the borderlands between England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales. In the borderlands, they were actually called borderers, and they were largely Presbyterian. They were largely, that is, after the Revolution or the Reformation took place. They lived for centuries in the first part of the second millennium in a state of continual conflict in all of the wars and battles that took place between people in Wales and Scotland and England. The borderers were people who they lived a marginal existence, and they often switched sides because they needed to kind of stay on top of the idea of survival. In 1603, right after Queen Elizabeth died, King James I came to power in England, and he was concluding a war with the Irish, with the Catholics in Ireland, and he succeeded in the war, and so he took many people, the borderers, these Scots-Irish Presbyterians who had been fighting on his side against the Catholic Irish. He transplanted them to the 6 northern counties of Ireland, eliminated the population, or moved the Catholic population away from those 6 counties of Northern Ireland, and placed the Scots-Irish there as a kind of barrier against the Catholics.
So basically, these are people with a history of constant warfare.
Conflict, trauma, violence, warfare.
And they brought that history with them to this country.
They left Ireland in vast numbers to come to the United States during the 1700s, before our revolution.
Do you think that helps to explain their sense of being so beleaguered here, the sense of the fundamentalists?
It's not just being beleaguered. It's also, I think we have to understand, the Continental Army, the American Revolutionary Army, a very hefty percentage of those soldiers were Scots-Irish who had come from Northern Ireland and from Wales and from England.
So we get some of our feistiness from this.
There's great stuff that we get out of that. It's a deep, deep desire for democracy, for individual freedom, a deep love of family, a love of community, a need and a desire to protect our families and our communities and to look for ways that they and that we can flourish.
And that seems to be the theme of your book, that this is a package that is profoundly conflicted, that there are these things that are precious, that run so deep, that are so spiritual, that are so worthy of honoring and emulating and keeping and replicating. And there are other parts that have caused so much pain and harm and are worthy of deep grief.
Well, we really have to look at it, don't we? I think I think that I can see this in my own family, going back through the generations that I looked at, that there's this powerful love of our families and of God and of America, of everything that this dream could mean. But there's also this need that we have to understand how we can find that constraining, the defensiveness that we find necessary to kind of wield, can lead us to ignore the fundamental teachings that Jesus gave us during his life on earth.
As you take this conversation out into the community with your book, The Sword of the Lord, what do you hope to accomplish?
I'd like us all to become fundamentalists, actually. And by that, I'm actually kind of pretty serious about it.
Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I think that the question, what is fundamental to your life? What really makes you tick? What are the values that you hold most dear? What are the fundamentals for you? That's a really important question. And the way that Jesus answered the question, somebody said, well, what's really important? What are the commandments that matter? And Jesus said, there are only two commandments that matter. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. And if you're not doing everything in your power throughout your life to love your neighbor as yourself in the broadest global sense of that word, then you're not focused on the true fundamentals.
Thank you for joining us today.
Right. Thank you.